The chair was already occupied when Constance entered the dining room. She had not hurried. She never hurried, not because she lacked urgency, but because she had learned, in 3 years of marriage to a man who watched for weakness the way other men watched for weather, that hurrying was a form of flinching. So, she came through the double doors at the pace she always kept, her hands quiet at her sides, and she saw it in the first half-second, the woman seated at the head of the table's right hand, in the carved chair with the blue silk cushion, the chair that had been her mother's and before that her grandmother's, the chair into which she had been formally installed on her wedding morning by the Duke's own steward, who had said the words, "This seat belongs to the Duchess of Ashmore," with the solemnity of a man reading a will. The woman in that chair was very beautiful. Constance noticed this the way she noticed everything, precisely, without sentiment, filing it away. Dark hair dressed high, a throat that warranted the diamonds she wore, hands that knew how to arrange themselves to advantage on a white tablecloth. She noticed, also, that every face at that table had turned to watch Constance's face. There were 8 guests. She knew 6 of them. They were waiting to see what she would do. What she did was nothing. She walked to the remaining chair, the one opposite, the lesser chair, the one the steward offered guests when the family places were claimed, and she sat down in it without a word, and she shook out her napkin with the small, precise flick she always used, and she looked down the length of candles at her husband. He had not risen. He sat at the table's head with his heavy jaw set and his dark eyes on her face, and he was waiting too, waiting for the tears, for the scene, for the ammunition. She did not give it to him. What she gave him was the polite, remote expression she had perfected in the first month of their marriage, the one that told him nothing, and she turned away from it to the guest on her left and said, "Lord Whitmore." "I had not heard you were returned from Harrogate. Was the water as dreadful as they say?" She did not yet know, as she said it, what the evening would cost. She knew what she suspected, had suspected for some months, with the quiet certainty of a woman who kept accounts and read faces, and understood that certain household expenditures do not appear in ledgers unless someone means them to go unremarked. But she had not yet traced the whole sum. She would trace it before the night was out. Had she known what she would find at the bottom of the column, she would have sat down in that lesser chair all the same. The dinner was served. It was not a short dinner. The woman in the blue silk chair was introduced, eventually, by the Duke, with the flat ease of a man who has decided the introduction is a formality rather than an apology. Mrs. Helena Voss, a friend of Lord Whitmore's acquaintance, visiting the county. Constance received this information with the expression she reserved for household inventory reports, attentive, neutral, acknowledging nothing beyond the facts stated. Helena Voss met her eyes once across the table. What lived in Helena Voss's face in that moment was not triumph. It was something more complicated, and Constance, who had made a study of what complicated things lived behind arranged expressions, filed it away without yet knowing what name to give it. The candles burned down a third. The footmen moved in their trained silence, and at the lower end of the table, seated between 2 women who had each separately made it their evening's business to pity Constance aloud in tones designed to be overheard, the butler, old Marsh, who had served the Ashmore household for 31 years and kept his opinions in his left eyebrow, set down a wine-glass with the particular precision of a man depositing a verdict. 3 weeks earlier, she had found the letter. She had not found it by searching. She had found it because she ran her household accounts herself, always had, a practice that the Duke had initially found eccentric and later found convenient, since it removed from him all obligation to attend to detail, and she had been reconciling the housekeeping ledger when the folded paper had fallen from between the pages of the previous month's dairy accounts, where it had been placed. She understood at once, by a hand that was neither hers nor Marsh's, nor any of the 3 women who kept the books below stairs. The paper had fallen face down. She had picked it up and read it. It was a note. 3 lines, in a hand she did not recognize. The sum it named was not small. The account it referenced was the Ashmore Trust account, the one held jointly and dispersed quarterly. The one she had never had occasion to examine because the Duke managed it exclusively, through his man of business, through a system of paper that she had never been invited to read. She had replaced the letter carefully. She had finished the accounts. She had said nothing to anyone. She had begun, instead, to count. Not money. There would be time for money. She had begun to count the weeks until the quarterly accounting was due to the estate trustee, who was old Sir Edmund Parish, who had been the late Duke's closest friend and who had never, in Constance's experience, found it comfortable to be lied to. 6 weeks remained. Then 5. Now 3. She had said nothing yet because she had not yet found the whole chain. She had found a link. There was a difference between a link and a chain, and she had learned this distinction from her father, who had been a solicitor of no great wealth but formidable precision, and who had died when she was 20, leaving her nothing but a method, which had proven, over the subsequent years, to be the most durable inheritance he could have managed. The dinner ended. The table rose. Every man stood when the women moved to leave. That was ordinary. What was not ordinary was that Lord Whitmore rose first and rose fastest, and Sir Thomas Cleeve rose beside him, and young Lord Avery, who was barely old enough to be trusted with his own opinions, rose and then turned visibly red, as though his body had known what his education had not yet managed to teach him, that there are moments when a room's morality becomes audible. And the sound it made tonight was chair legs on oak, 8 of them, all at once, rising not for Helena Voss, but for Constance, who was walking toward the door. She heard it. She did not turn. She kept her eyes ahead and her hands still, and she walked the way she always walked, which was without hurry, which was without flinching, and she did not allow herself to feel the warmth of it until she was through the door and in the corridor with the door closed behind her, and then she pressed her back against the wall for exactly 3 seconds and closed her eyes. Marsh was waiting. He was always waiting. He had the look of a hound who has learned not to bark, but has not learned how to stop his ears from lifting. "The blue sitting room is warm," he said. "Or I can have the library opened." "The library," she said. "And Marsh, the household correspondence for the past 8 months. All of it." His left eyebrow moved. "All of it, Your Grace. Every piece. He brought it within 20 minutes. He did not ask why. He was the sort of man who understood that some questions are themselves an answer, and he did not wish to be an answer to the wrong question. She sat in the library until 2 in the morning. The fire settled twice. She read with the methodical focus her father had taught her, which was not the focus of a woman searching for something specific, but of a woman making absolutely certain she had found everything there was to find before she moved a single piece. Letters from the Duke's man of business, a Mr. Aldous Vane, who had held the position for 4 years, who had been recommended by the Duke's cousin rather than inherited from the previous administration, who wrote in a fine, controlled hand and whose arithmetic was impeccable. Impeccably false, she had determined by midnight. The method was not complicated. It was elegant, which was worse, a kind of quiet systematic siphoning. The difference between each real disbursement and each recorded disbursement never large enough to ring a bell, always plausible, always attributable to ordinary variance in quarterly costs. Only someone who ran their household accounts themselves, who had developed an instinct for the texture of honest numbers, would have caught the wobble. She had been meant to catch it. That was what she understood at 2 in the morning, sitting with 8 months of paper arranged in the firelight. Someone had placed that letter where she would find it. Not Vane. Vane was too careful. Not the Duke. The Duke would not have troubled himself. Someone else had placed it. Someone in this house. Someone who wanted her to look, and she had not yet worked out who or why, and until she did, she would remain still. She put the papers away. She went to bed. She slept. In the morning, Helena Voss came to call. This was not, on its face, remarkable. Guests of the house called on the Duchess as a matter of form. What was remarkable was that Helena Voss came alone, dismissed the footman at the sitting-room door, waited until she heard his steps retreat, and then sat down in the chair nearest the fire without being invited and looked at Constance with an expression that had nothing polished in it. "You are wondering why I am here," she said. "I am wondering a great deal," Constance said. "I thought I might let you choose where to begin." Helena Voss looked at her hands. They were not steady. This was the first thing that did not fit the arrangement Constance had constructed for her. "I did not choose the chair," she said. "Last evening. I sat where Vane directed me." The name hit somewhere behind Constance's sternum. She let nothing onto her face. "Aldous Vane directed your seating. He told me it was the customary place for a principal guest. He told me." She stopped. She was doing the thing people did when they discovered they had been the instrument of something they did not choose. Her jaw tightened. "He told me you would not come down until later, that there was time to settle the arrangement." Her eyes came up. "I am not what you think I am. Tell me what I think you are." The Duke's mistress. The word was plain. She did not flinch from it. "I was. For a time. That time is concluded. I came to this house because Vane told me the Duke wished a private word about certain financial matters, and because I was fool enough to believe that the carriage fare was the only thing the visit would cost me." Her chin came up. "I spent last evening being displayed to ruin you, and I spent last night working out the sum, and I am here this morning because I have no particular interest in being Aldous Vane's instrument any further than I already have been." Constance looked at her for a long time. Outside, a thrush was working through its morning industry in the box hedge, indifferent to everything inside the house. "What do you know about Vane?" she said. It took 2 hours. It was the most productive 2 hours Constance had spent in 3 years of marriage. Sir Edmund Parish arrived on a Thursday, 3 weeks before the quarterly accounting was due, because Constance had written to him on the Monday and framed the matter as a question about historical disbursements that she was too inexperienced to resolve herself, a fiction she deployed without apology, having learned that men of Edmund's generation were quicker to come to the aid of incompetence than of competence, and that the distinction mattered less than the arrival. He was 71 years old and walked with a stick and had a face like a well-used boot and a mind like a freshly sharpened blade, and he had never found it comfortable to be lied to. He was precisely the instrument she needed, and he was sitting in the library by 2:30. The Duke was not in the house. This was not an accident. He had been invited, the previous evening, to accompany Lord Whitmore to look at some property Whitmore was considering, an invitation extended by Whitmore at Constance's request, Whitmore having been the sort of man who, when a woman he respected asked a measured favor, did not inquire too closely into the machinery behind the request. Marsh poured the tea. Constance laid out the papers. She did not say, "Vane is a thief." She said, "I have noticed some things I cannot account for, Sir Edmund, and I wonder if you might help me understand whether my arithmetic is wrong." Then she handed him the papers in the order she had arranged them, which was not chronological but architectural, the way you show a man a building, starting with the exterior so he can see the shape, and then opening the door. She watched his face while he read. He had a habit of touching his thumbnail to his lower lip when he encountered something that interested him. He did it 11 times in 40 minutes. On the 12th time, he looked up. "Where did you find this?" His voice was very quiet. The quieter a man's voice got, she had noticed, the more it meant. "The letter came to me by accident," she said. Or what appeared to be accident. She had thought carefully about how much to tell him. She told him most of it. She did not tell him about Helena Voss yet. Helena Voss had asked, with the directness of a woman who had very little left to spend on dignity, to be kept out of it until the moment she was needed. "The variance in the quarterly figures," Sir Edmund said. "Yes, over how many quarters?" 11, possibly 12, though the 12th is harder to establish because the original invoice is missing from the file. "I noted the absence. You noted the absence of a document." "I note absences," she said. "It is a habit my father gave me." He looked at the papers again. Then he looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating something he had been measuring by the wrong instrument. "Your father was in the law." "He was, and you have been running these accounts yourself since the first month of my marriage. Does the Duke know that?" "The Duke," she said carefully, "knows that I manage the household. I do not believe he has inquired closely into the method." Edmund's thumbnail went to his lip again. "The accounting is due in 3 weeks. Yes, Vane will present his figures. Yes, and if you present yours, then someone in that room will be wrong," she said. "I thought it might be useful to establish, beforehand, which of us has the better arithmetic." There was a pause. The thrush had moved from the box hedge to somewhere closer, and its voice came through the window glass with the cheerful indifference of creatures who have no interest in human bookkeeping. "Lady Constance," Sir Edmund said. He had not called her that in 3 years. He had called her Your Grace, as was proper, with the careful deference of a man who did not wish to remind himself of what he thought of the match at the time it was made. "I wonder if you might show me the Michaelmas disbursements for the last 4 years. I have them here," she said, and set the second folder in front of him. He arrived at the shape of it by the time Marsh brought the second pot. He did not say the word fraud. He said, in the voice of a man measuring every syllable for weight and necessity, "I will need to speak with Vane directly, and I will need to do so on the accounting day before the figures are submitted." He paused. "I will also need anyone else who has direct knowledge of this matter to be present." "I can arrange that," she said. "And the Duke must be there." "Yes," she said. "He must." She had thought about this part. She had thought about it the way she thought about anything that required her to calculate costs before she could afford to feel them, which was to lay it flat and look at it plainly. Her husband had not, perhaps, known the full extent of what Vane was doing. She did not yet know what he had known. She knew only what she could demonstrate, and what she could demonstrate was the accounts, and the accounts told their own story, and she would stand in the room when that story was told, and she would be steady, and whatever it meant for her marriage she would face afterward, when the material question was settled. You could not mourn a loss and count it at the same time. Her father had taught her that. Marsh found her in the corridor afterward. He did not speak. He had the quality, rare in any being, of understanding that some silences are more respectful than words. He walked beside her as far as the staircase, and then stopped, and she stopped too, and looked at him. "Marsh," she said. "The letter that fell from the dairy ledger." His face did not move. "You placed it there," she said. It was not a question. A pause. His left eyebrow made its smallest possible movement. "There are things," he said carefully, "that a man in my position sees over 31 years of service. There are also things that are not properly his to say. But there are some things, he paused again, with the precision of a man choosing words the way a jeweler chooses settings, that a person in the right position to notice might, in the natural course of tidying correspondence, misplace, and Mrs. Voss. I had occasion to speak with Mrs. Voss on the evening of her arrival, yes, before Mr. Vane had an opportunity to provide her with further instructions. She looked at him for a long moment. He bore the scrutiny with the perfect stillness of a man who has spent 31 years perfecting it. "Thank you," she said. It was not enough. It was all she had that she could give him here, in the corridor where anyone might pass. He received it with a slight inclination of his head that managed, somehow, to contain everything a much longer speech might have said. "The dining room chair has been restored to its customary arrangement, Your Grace," he said. "The blue silk cushion is properly placed." "Thank you, Marsh. Will there be anything else?" "Not tonight," she said. "But on the accounting day, I will need you in the room." He nodded. "I have never," he said, "missed an accounting day." She went upstairs. For the first time in 3 weeks, she slept before midnight. The Duke came home on Friday and was informed by Marsh that Sir Edmund Parish had called and would return on the accounting day with some questions about the trust records. She watched her husband receive this information from across the breakfast table. He was a large man, broad-shouldered, with a heaviness about him that she had once, in the first months, taken for gravity, but had come to understand was something closer to inertia, the heaviness of a man who had never been required to move toward anything, because everything had always been arranged to arrive at him. He looked up from his coffee and looked at her across the table, and she gave him the polite, remote expression and reached for the marmalade, and he looked away. He said nothing to her about the seating arrangement. She had not expected that he would. They were two people who had learned to conduct their marriage in the space between what was said and what was true, and that space had been growing for 3 years like a room no one cleaned, gathering the particular stillness of somewhere that has been given up. What she had not expected was what happened on the Saturday. She was in the library. She spent a great deal of time in the library, which the Duke had never found reason to use, working through the final quarter's figures when the door opened, and it was not Marsh who came in, but the Duke himself, which was unusual enough that she looked up before she had composed her expression. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at the papers spread across the table. He looked at her face. Something moved in his, something she could not quite read, which was itself unusual. She could read most faces, but his had always been the one that defied her, perhaps because he had fewer feelings than most people, and therefore less to obscure. "Constance," he said. Just her name. "Elliot," she said. His given name. She used it rarely enough that it sat between them in the air for a moment with a slight weight. He came into the room. He did not sit. He stood with his hand on the back of a chair, and he looked at the papers, and he said, "What are you doing?" She considered several answers and chose the one that was entirely true. "I am finishing the quarterly figures," she said. Before the accounting day. He was quiet for a moment. She watched his hand on the back of the chair. He had working hands, large, capable, slightly calloused along the thumb, which were at odds with everything else he presented to the world. She had noticed this early in their marriage and filed it without knowing yet what cabinet it belonged in. "Edmund Parish has questions about the trust records," he said. "Yes, you wrote to him." "I did." Another pause. Outside, it had begun to rain, a soft, unhurried autumn rain that laid itself across the window glass in the quiet way of something that intends to stay. "Did you find something?" he said. His voice was very level. In the accounts, she looked at him steadily. "I found some things I cannot account for," she said, which was what she had said to Edmund, and was equally and precisely true. I thought it would be better to have Edmund present when we looked at them together. Something moved across his face again. She still could not name it. He nodded once and left the room, and she sat for a moment with her hands flat on the papers and her eyes on the door he had closed behind him, and she thought. He did not know. Or not all of it. She would not know what he had known until the accounting day, and she would not allow herself to decide before then. This was also something her father had taught her, the discipline of suspended verdict, the understanding that a column of figures means nothing until it is complete. The accounting day was a Tuesday. The rain had not stopped. The library was the largest room suited to the occasion, and it had been laid out by Marsh with the quiet authority of a man who understood that the arrangement of chairs is itself an argument. Sir Edmund at the head of the table with his black notebook and his expression of a man about to look at a wound. The Duke at his right, Constance at his left. Aldous Vane in the chair that faced all three of them, which she had specified, because she wanted to be able to watch his face, and because she knew, from long study of the geometry of confrontation, that the person with the most to hide will always glance first at the person they fear most. She had also specified, without explanation, that 2 additional chairs be placed against the wall, one for Marsh, who stood in his position near the door, and one that was presently empty. Vane arrived precisely on time, which was itself a kind of boast. Only people who are confident in their position arrive precisely. He was 43 years old and immaculate in a way that took effort and was designed to look effortless. And he had a voice like warm water that he used to make difficult things sound like matters of simple administration. He greeted the Duke with the ease of familiarity. He greeted Sir Edmund with the measured respect of a man who knows he is being evaluated. He greeted Constance with the particular attention of a man making a calculation. She could see it happening behind his eyes, that quick reckoning, and then he placed his hands on his leather document case, and he waited. "Let us begin," Sir Edmund said, with the Michaelmas disbursements. Vane presented his figures. They were beautiful. They were the best false figures she had ever seen, internally consistent, footnoted, cross-referenced in 3 places, the kind of numbers that make a man who isn't suspicious feel foolish for even imagining doubt. Constance sat, with her hands folded and her figures in the folder in front of her, and she said nothing. She waited. Edmund asked his questions with the steady patience of a man who is not in a hurry because he has already arrived. Vane answered each one. His voice stayed warm, his hands stayed still on the document case. He glanced once at the Duke. The Duke's face gave him nothing, which Constance registered with the small, precise click of a thing falling into a place she had not known was waiting for it. Then Edmund said, "I would like to look at the Michaelmas rents from the Dorley holding for the past 4 years. A pause. Half a second. She saw it, and she knew Edmund saw it. The calculation, the quick interior inventory of risk, the decision to proceed with confidence because confidence was all he had. "Of course," Vane said, and opened his case and produced the Dorley figures. Edmund looked at them for a moment and then set them beside the figures he had brought himself, figures he had pulled. He had told her in a brief note that morning from the original estate records held in trust, which Vane had never had access to, because they predated his tenure and were kept, sealed, in the offices of the parish firm. Vane saw the 2 sets of figures laid side by side. She watched the warmth in his face do the thing warmth does when it is not genuine. It did not cool. Exactly. It organized itself into something more careful. He glanced at her. She gave him nothing. She was very good at nothing. The rents from Dorley, Sir Edmund said, setting his thumbnail to his lower lip, appear to have been recorded differently in these two documents. A clerical variance, Vane said. His voice was still warm. Dorley underwent a tenancy change in the second year of my tenure. The transition created some irregularity in how the income was categorized. Edmund did not look up from the papers. And the Harrow Mill Quarterly in the same year? Another pause, shorter than the last because he had prepared for this one. A drainage issue delayed the Q3 payment, he said. It was received in Q4 and consolidated. I see. Edmund turned a page, and the Constance Dowager bequest, the one held separately in the secondary trust? This pause was different from the others. She felt the Duke shift in his chair beside her. She did not look at either of them. She looked at Vane. The secondary trust records, Vane began. Were they consolidated as well? Edmund said mildly. Vane's hands moved. It was the first time his hands had moved since he sat down. He placed them flat on the document case, which was not where they had been. They had been loose, relaxed, performed relaxation. Now they were flat and deliberate, and a person who read hands as carefully as she read faces would understand that the deliberateness was the thing, that the change was the confession. The secondary trust, Vane said, is a separate instrument. I would need to review the relevant documentation before. I have it here, Edmund said, and set a third folder on the table. Then the door opened, and Helena Voss came in. She had come from the empty chair against the wall. Marsh had shown her in through the library's secondary entrance, the one the family used, the one that connected to the corridor from the morning room, which meant she had been in the house since before the session began. Constance had arranged this with the same quiet particularity she had arranged everything else. She had also arranged, with Helena's knowledge and consent, exactly what Helena would say, and exactly when. Helena did not look at the Duke. She looked at Vane, and what lived in her face was not the complicated thing Constance had seen at the dinner table. It was simpler now. It had been clarified by 3 weeks of sitting with it. Mr. Vane told me, Helena said, addressing Sir Edmund, with the steadiness of a woman who has decided that steadiness is the only thing she has left to offer, that the Duke had requested my visit. He told me that certain financial arrangements would be discussed that would secure my situation in exchange for my presence. She stopped. He also told me that the Duchess would not be at dinner. He was specific about the seating. Her chin came up. He lied about all of it, she said. I was a prop. I think he meant me to be a distraction, or a degradation, or both. She looked at Vane with the expression of someone who has simplified a complicated feeling into its most essential form. I want to say so, clearly, in front of witnesses. Vane's face had gone through several arrangements in the time it took her to speak. She had been watching. The last arrangement it settled into was the one she had been waiting for, not the warmth, not the calculation, but something underneath both. A genuine and undefended alarm, the look of a man who has realized that the instruments he trusted have become the instruments of his undoing. Mr. Vane, Sir Edmund said, in the voice of a man who is not going to shout because shouting would be imprecise. I have here 4 quarterly statements, the original trust records, and the testimony of a witness. I am also in possession, and here he opened the third folder and produced a single sheet of paper and held it toward the light of the window, a motion that was so quiet and so deliberate that everything in the room oriented toward it the way plants orient toward the source of warmth, of a letter, written in your hand. To an account in Antwerp. The letter had not come from Constance. She had not known about the letter. Edmund had found it in the trust records, filed between 2 quarterly statements with the care of a man who is hiding something in a place he assumes no one will look, because no one has ever looked. It was the link she had not found, because it was the link that connected the visible chain to the whole engine, and seeing it now in Edmund's hands felt like watching the last figure in a column be written in. Vane looked at the letter. He looked at the three faces across the table from him. He looked at Marsh, who stood by the door with his hands behind his back and his face perfectly composed, and his left eyebrow precisely still. Then he looked at the Duke. The Duke had not spoken. He had been sitting at Edmund's right, with his large hands flat on the table, and his face doing the thing it always did when he was thinking, which was very little, which she had once taken for emptiness and now understood was the face of a man who had trained himself to contain rather than express, who had learned this the same way she had learned her own armor. In some early experience she did not know yet, and might never know, and who was sitting here now in a room with a catastrophe of his own man's making and processing it in that same contained, expensive silence. "I don't," Vane began. His voice was no longer warm. It was still controlled, which she gave him credit for, because most men's voices did something louder when they broke. "I can explain the Antwerp account. Please do," Sir Edmund said, and set the letter on the table and folded his hands. What followed was not a confession. It was the near confession, which is the thing that happens when a man who has prepared for every question finds himself in a room where the question he prepared for is not the question being asked. He answered around it. He qualified. He referenced documentation he would need to retrieve. He said the word mischaracterization 3 times. He did not say "I am sorry," and he did not say "I did not do it," because by now the room knew that those were the only 2 things he could say, and he had managed to say neither. Edmund let him finish. Then he said, "Mr. Vane, the letter names the account, the sum, and the date. The date corresponds to the Q2 disbursement that appears in your records as a drainage repair." He paused. "Is there a drainage repair?" A silence. "Mr. Vane, there were," Vane said carefully, "some water management issues on the east. Mr. Tucson," Sir Edmund said, and the name was addressed to the corner of the room where a man had been sitting so quietly that several people had perhaps forgotten he was there. A small, dry-faced man in a dark coat who was the parish firm's man of accounts and who now opened his own folder and read aloud, in a clear and uninflected voice, the surveyor's report from Dorley dated 18 months earlier, in which the east boundary drainage was rated sound, requiring no intervention, not expected to require intervention for several years. Vane's hands were no longer flat. He had interlaced his fingers, which is what hands do when they are trying to hold something together. She looked at him then with the same clear, unhurried attention she had given to everything else in this room, and she saw it the moment the calculation stopped. Not because he had run out of calculations. She suspected he would be calculating until they put him in the ground. It was the way his mind was shaped. But because the calculation had completed, and the sum at the bottom was beyond what any number could redeem. In the lines of his face she saw something she had not expected and had not prepared herself for. A grief that was not performed, some specific loss, sitting inside all the precision of what he had done, that was real. She did not know what he had wanted. Money, certainly, but money is rarely about money. She had learned this from her father. Money is almost always about something it stands for, some comfort or safety or position that a man once lacked and has been trying to secure ever since, with instruments that cannot actually secure it. She did not know his history. She knew only his hands, which were holding on to each other now with the quiet desperation of someone who has nothing left to hold. "Elliot," Sir Edmund said. He used the Duke's given name with the ease of a man who had known him since he was 8 years old, and had earned the license by decades. "What would you like to do?" The Duke did not move for a moment. Then he looked at Constance. It was the first time in the session that he had looked at her directly, without the careful social calibration they had both learned. Just looked at her, the way people look at each other when the ordinary furniture of a relationship has been cleared away by catastrophe, and what is left is two people in a room. She looked back at him. She did not know, yet, what he had known. She did not know if this was the beginning of something or the end of something, or merely the visible surface of a thing that had always been underneath. She knew only that she was here, and composed, and had done what she could do, and that what happened next was his to choose. "Edmund," the Duke said, his voice even, "I would like to give Vane 2 hours to settle his affairs. I would like his resignation in writing before he leaves the house. I would like the Antwerp account transferred to the estate in full before the end of the month. And I would like," he paused, "I would like no scandal. His family is not responsible for this." Vane looked at him. His face had gone somewhere far from the room. "In exchange," the Duke said, "I will not pursue the criminal matter. Edmund, you will confirm the accounts are square when the transfer is complete. Vane, you will not return to this county." A long silence. "You are being more generous than I deserve," Vane said. His voice, for the first time, had no architecture in it, just the voice itself, underneath everything else. "Probably," the Duke said. He looked at Constance again. "It is not entirely my decision to make." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked at Vane. She thought of the grief she had seen in his face. She thought of his family, who were not here, who had not asked for any of this. She thought of her father, who had practiced the law for 30 years and had said to her once, when she was 15 and burning with the particular righteous fury of 15, "There is very little satisfaction, Connie, in being the one who throws the stone. The satisfaction is in knowing the truth. The stone is just noise." "The Duke's terms," she said to Vane, "are the terms." He left the room within the hour. The rain had stopped. It did not begin again. Edmund shook her hand when he left, which was not a thing he had ever done, and which she received with all the composure she had left, which was enough. Just barely. Helena Voss had gone before the session ended, quietly, through the same door she had entered. Marsh had seen her out, and Constance knew, without having to be told, that Marsh had also pressed an envelope into her hand, an envelope whose contents Constance had specified in the letter she had written the previous Thursday, because there are some accounts that must be settled in private. The modest sum inside was not charity, it was remuneration, for service rendered under difficult circumstances, and she had framed it as such in the accompanying note, because Helena Voss had enough dignity left that it mattered what words went with the money. The library emptied. Mr. Tewson packed his folder. Edmund closed his notebook with the small, satisfied pressure of a man concluding a piece of work. Marsh began to straighten the chairs. Then there were only 2 people left in the room. She was gathering her own papers. She did not hurry. She had learned not to hurry, and she was not going to unlearn it now. She heard the Duke cross the room, not toward the door, toward her, and she stilled her hands on the papers and waited. He stopped at the opposite side of the table. She looked up. His face had cleared to something she had not seen on it before, not the inertia, not the calculation, not the careful social surface. Something more direct than any of those, and more uncertain, which was the thing she had not expected. She had not expected him to look uncertain. She had not thought him capable of it. 3 weeks, he said. Nearly 4, she said. The letter came on a Friday. You said nothing. I had nothing complete to say. He was quiet for a moment. She watched his hand on the back of the chair. He had working hands, large, capable, slightly calloused along the thumb, which were at odds with everything else he presented to the world. "You ran these accounts yourself," he said. "All of them. From the first month. Yes, and you found the error." "My father left me a method," she said. "He left me very little else, but the method has proved adequate." Something moved across his face that might, in a man with less practice at composure, have been a different kind of expression. "I did not know," he said, "what Vane was doing. I want to be precise, I did not know the full extent. I knew he was managing." He stopped, and she watched him choose his words with the care of a man who has decided, perhaps recently, that the difference between accurate and convenient matters. "I knew there were arrangements I had not looked at closely. I had not looked because it was easier not to." That is not the same as not knowing, but it is also not entirely knowing, and I want to be honest with you about where the line was. She looked at him. She had looked at many faces, in many rooms, and she had learned that the most reliable indicator of a person's character was not what they said when things were easy, but what they said when things were already lost, when there was nothing left to gain from the careful version. He was not giving her the careful version. "I know what it cost you," he said, "to sit in that chair on Tuesday evening." "The lesser chair," she said. Yes, she thought about Tuesday evening. She thought about walking through the door and seeing the blue silk cushion occupied. She thought about the 3 seconds in the corridor with her eyes closed. She thought about what it cost, precisely, and whether the cost was paid now or still being paid, and she could not entirely answer the question, which meant the account was not yet settled and she should not pretend it was. "It costs something," she said. "I have not yet finished counting." He received this without flinching, which she noted. "I would like." He stopped. He tried again. "I do not know how to do this," he said. "I mean that literally. I have not had occasion to learn. I was not raised in a house where, this kind of speaking, I do not know the method. My father's method," she said, "was to lay the thing flat on the table and look at it plainly. Whatever it is." He looked at her for a moment. "Then," he said, "plainly, I have managed this marriage the way I have managed most things. From a distance. I told myself it was consideration. It was not. It was cowardice of a particular kind, the cowardice of not wanting to look at something closely in case it required me to change." His hands were flat on the table. She could see the calluses along the thumb. "The chair was wrong. Vane placed it, and I did not correct it. That is also something I knew and did not look at closely, and I am telling you now because you deserve the precise account." She was quiet for a long time. Outside, a bird began its business in the hedge, not the thrush. This one, something smaller, with a more tentative voice. The fire had burned to a low, steady patience. "Elliot," she said. His name? Again. It sat in the air between them as it had that morning, with its small weight. "Why do you have a laborer's hands?" He looked down at them on the table. Then he looked up at her with an expression so unguarded that she felt she had seen something she was not meant to see, which was exactly what it was. "My father's estate had a tenant farm," he said. "When I was 12, there was a bad season. The men needed help. My father," he paused, "my father felt it was beneath us. I disagreed. Privately, I went out before dawn and came back after dark, for 3 weeks. Something like a ghost of something crossed his face. The foreman never told. He left me a knife when he died. I still have it." She looked at him, and she thought of 3 years of managing at a distance. She thought of a 12-year-old rising before dawn. She thought of the chair with the blue silk cushion and what it would have cost her if she were different, if she had been someone who could afford to be broken by it. She thought of the letter falling from the dairy ledger and Marcia's left eyebrow, and Helena Voss saying I was a prop, and all the links of the change she had laid flat on the table until the whole sum was clear. She did not yet know if they could build something. She knew only what had been accounted for and what had not. I am not going to tell you what I want from this marriage, she said carefully, because I do not yet know, and because you have not asked me. She paused. But I am going to be in the library tomorrow morning, going over the final quarter. If you would like to know how the method works, you are welcome to come. He looked at her. Something in his face did the thing she had tracked in the library that morning, the clearing, the inertia going, something smaller and more genuine underneath. I will be there, he said. At 8, she said. I start at 8. I will be there at 8. She gathered her papers and walked to the door. Then she stopped. She turned back. He was still standing at the table, his hands on the surface, his face doing the new thing it was doing. The chair, she said, on Tuesday evening, when you did not rise. He held her gaze. If I had wept, she said, or made a scene or left the table, would you have been relieved? A pause. Then, yes, he said. It cost him something to say it. She could see the cost. I am not proud of that. No, she said, but I am glad you said it plainly. She went to bed that night and did not press her back against the wall. She slept from 10 until 6, which was the longest she had slept in 4 years. He was in the library at 10 past 7. She did not say anything about the time. She showed him the method. He asked 3 questions. One of them was the right question, the question that went straight to the thing that had taken her 2 hours to understand, and she looked at him asking it with that direct, unguarded attention, and she thought, there it is, the mind underneath the management. It had been there the whole time, she supposed, the way a thing can be behind a door for years before anyone troubles to open it. They worked until noon. Marsh brought coffee and said nothing about the hour. In the weeks that followed, autumn arrived in the county with its usual authority, the light thinning, the hedges turning, the mornings arriving later, and with a new chill that seemed to come not from the air, but from the ground. She noticed it the way she always noticed things, precisely, with satisfaction, filing it as data about the season's turn. She had liked autumn since she was a girl, for the same reason she liked completed accounts. The year was settling. The long sum was being entered. She and the Duke, Elliot, worked in the library most mornings now. He had a way of going still when he was reading figures that she recognized as the same quality she had mistaken for inertia, understanding now that stillness and inertia are not the same thing at all, that some people go still because they are not moving, and some people go still because they are thinking very hard in a very small space. He thought in a small space. She had learned to read the difference. The Antwerp account was transferred in full before the end of the month. Edmund confirmed the accounts square in a brief, formal letter with a single line at the bottom that read, "Your father would have been impressed by the method," written with the hand of a man who does not say such things often and has therefore not made them cheap. She kept the letter. She put it in the same place she kept her father's notebook. On a Thursday morning in October, they were arguing about a drainage survey. Genuinely, productively arguing. The kind that ends in a better answer than either person started with, when he said something dry about the surveyor's inability to identify standing water even when wearing it, and she laughed before she had decided to, and he stopped mid-sentence and looked at her. "That is the first time," he said, "that I've made you laugh." "I know," she said. "I notice things," he said. "Carefully, I have not always shown that I noticed, but I notice." She looked at him. The fire was doing its low, patient work in the grate. Outside, a late thrush was adding to its notes something that sounded like the beginnings of a farewell to the season. She thought of the phrase she had spoken to him the first morning in the library, when he asked about the method. "My father left me very little else." She thought of what he had said about the foreman and the knife and rising before dawn. She thought of what it cost and whether it was still being counted, and she knew the answer now, which was that it was, and that the cost was real, and that she was choosing to pay it with her eyes open, which is the only honest way to pay any cost. "Elliot," she said, "I am not going to make this conditional. I want you to hear that clearly. I am not marrying you in exchange for the accounting, or the chair, or the apology. Those are already settled. They are not the currency." She held his gaze steadily. "What I am saying now is something different. I am saying I would like to stay. Because I choose it. Not because it is the arrangement, or the obligation, or the sensible thing, although it is all of those. Because I choose it." He was quiet for a moment. The fire shifted. He said, "In 3 years, no one has ever said that to me." "Said what?" "That they chose it. Any of it. Because they wished to." He looked at his hands on the desk, then back at her. "My father married for alliance. My mother married because she was told to. I married because—" He paused, and she waited, and he said, with the plainness she had asked of him, "Because you were described to me as sensible and unlikely to cause difficulty." "Which is a shameful reason," stated plainly. "It is," she agreed, "but you are stating it plainly." "I am trying to learn the method," he said. "It does not come naturally." She thought of the foreman and the knife. "Most worthwhile things don't," she said. They were married again. Not in any legal or formal sense. They were already married, had been for 3 years, but in the sense that sometimes a thing you have held at arm's length is finally brought close, and you understand that the holding at arm's length was the error, and you let it be close. The library at 7:10 on a Tuesday morning in October was where this happened, with no witnesses but the fire and the rain beginning again at the window, and Marsh's quiet knock 15 minutes later, announcing that coffee was ready, which it had been for some time. They married in the formal sense again at Christmas, or rather, they renewed their vows in the chapel on the estate, which had been Elliot's suggestion, advanced in the same quiet, careful way he had started to advance things that cost him something to say. It was small. Edmund stood as witness with the pleased gravity of a man who has waited 3 years for a question to resolve. Marsh wept in the doorway with the controlled devastation of a man who had not expected to be moved and was furious at the evidence. Helena Voss wrote from Bath in January to say that she had taken a position as a companion to a family of quality who treated her well, and was, unexpectedly, content. Constance wrote back. They corresponded, irregularly, for years afterward, the kind of correspondence that is not friendship exactly, but is the thing that survives when 2 people have shared the difficult underside of a situation and emerged with their respective dignities intact. It was, she had decided, a kind of account that does not appear in ledgers and is all the more real for it. Aldous Vane went to the continent. No scandal followed him, which was the arrangement, and whatever he found there, she never knew. She thought of him occasionally, in the way she thought of a sum once she had closed the ledger, finished, filed, not forgotten, not open. She had seen his grief in that room, the thing underneath the calculation. She had extended mercy from behind that knowledge, which is the only position from which mercy is not weakness. Lord Whitmore told her, in the spring, that the betting book at his club had been retired with a settlement paid to the house by 3 gentlemen who had bet against her. She received this information with the expression she reserved for items of mild interest, and said that she hoped the house had invested it sensibly. Lord Whitmore laughed for some time. The tenant farm at the east boundary had a difficult spring. The drainage had not, in fact, been as sound as the survey suggested, and the estate spent April in mud and negotiation. Elliot went out before dawn on the worst of the days, in boots and working clothes, and came back after dark and said nothing about it, and she had walked past the kitchen yard and seen him at the pump in the last of the light, washing the day from his hands with the ease of a man for whom this was not new, and she had stood there for a moment and thought, there is the 12-year-old, and there is the man, and they are the same, and she had understood why the foreman had left him the knife. It was the following October, a year and 3 weeks after the accounting day, almost to the day, when she came through the double doors of the dining room at her usual pace, which was unhurried, which was without flinching, and found the room laid for dinner, and the fire well established, and Elliot already at the table, which was unusual. He was not a man who arrived early to rooms, and in the carved chair with the blue silk cushion, the chair that had been her mother's and before that her grandmother's, the chair into which she had been formally installed on her wedding morning, there was no one. There was no one, because the chair was hers. He stood when she entered. She had noticed, over the past year, that he always stood when she entered a room, which was not unusual for a man of his station, but which he did with a particular attention that was, she had filed it, had been filing it for months, without knowing yet what category it fell into. Now, she understood. It fell into the category of things chosen. Deliberately, each time, she sat in the blue silk chair. She shook out her napkin with the small, precise flick she always used. She looked down the length of the candles at him. Marsh tells me the thrush has come back to the box hedge, she said. It arrived this morning, he said. It brought opinions. It always does, she said. Some things do, he said, and the corner of his mouth moved, which was the thing it did now, not often, but reliably, at the moments she least expected, and she allowed herself, with the full and undefended composure of a woman who has settled the account and knows precisely what she has chosen, and why, to be glad of it. The candles burned. The dinner was served. Outside, the autumn went about its patient work, and the thrush said what it had to say to the darkening air, and the year turned toward its close with the particular quiet warmth of something well made, honestly paid for, and finally, at last, complete. If this story settled something in you, the way a ledger closes when the columns finally come true, then you know the feeling I was after tonight. There is a chair by the fire here, and the kettle has not yet gone cold, and there will be another story next time for anyone who pulls it close. I would be glad if you stayed. Tell me in the comments, at what moment did you know? Was it the letter in the dairy ledger, the hands at the pump in the last of the light, or something else? The moment you thought, there it is. And if these fireside stories are the kind of company you want to keep, there is a place saved for you here at the hearth. Subscribe, and I will leave the light on. Sleep well tonight, and be patient with the ones who are still learning to lay the thing flat on the table and say it plainly. It takes some of us longer than others. It is worth the wait.